I never thought my life would turn out this way. I always believed in trust, in loyalty, in the sanctity of marriage. But sometimes, life throws you a curveball that shatters everything you thought you knew. This is my story. A story of love, betrayal, and the painful journey of picking up the pieces. My name is Alex, and I've been married to my wife, Sarah, for 10 years. We met in college, and from the moment I saw her, I knew she was the one. She was beautiful, smart, and had this infectious laugh that could light up any room. We built a life together, a home, a family, and what I thought was an unbreakable bond. We have 2 kids, Emily and Jake, who are the center of our world. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and I was happy. I worked hard to provide for my family. I'm not the kind of guy who chases after big dreams or wants to climb the corporate ladder. I just wanted a stable job, a happy family, and a peaceful life. That's why I stayed at my job for so long, even though it wasn't glamorous. I worked as a mid-level manager at a logistics company. It wasn't my passion, but it paid the bills, and I was good at it. My boss, Mark, was a charismatic guy who always seemed to have everything under control. He was the kind of person who could talk his way out of anything, and everyone admired him, including me. But looking back now, I realize how naive I was. I trusted Mark. I trusted Sarah. I trusted the life we had built together. And that trust was my downfall. It all started about 6 months ago. Sarah had been acting differently, distant, preoccupied, and sometimes even cold. At first, I thought it was just stress. She had taken on a new role at her job, and I knew she was under a lot of pressure. I tried to be supportive, to give her space when she needed it. But no matter what I did, it felt like there was a wall between us. A wall I couldn't break through. One night after the kids were asleep, I decided to talk to her. I asked her if everything was okay, if there was something bothering her. She looked at me with this strange expression, like she was about to say something but then changed her mind. "I'm just tired," she said. "Work has been crazy lately." I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was my wife, the mother of my children. I had no reason to doubt her. But then, little things started adding up. She would come home late from work, saying she had meetings or deadlines. She started dressing differently, more polished, more put together. And then there were the phone calls. She would take calls in another room, whispering in a way that made my stomach churn. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was reading too much into things. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The breaking point came one Friday evening. I had left work early to surprise Sarah with dinner. I picked up the kids from school, cooked her favorite meal, and even bought a bottle of wine. I was excited to spend some quality time together, to reconnect after weeks of feeling like strangers. But when she walked through the door, she barely looked at me. She seemed distracted, almost annoyed that I was there. "What's all this?" she asked, gesturing to the table. "I just thought we could have a nice dinner together," I said, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. She sighed and sat down, picking at her food without really eating. The kids were chattering away, but the tension between us was palpable. After dinner, she went straight to bed, saying she was exhausted. I stayed up, staring at the TV but not really watching it. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I noticed her phone on the coffee table. It buzzed, and the screen lit up with a message from Mark. My heart stopped. Why was my boss texting my wife? I picked up the phone, my hands trembling. The message was short, but devastating. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Last night was amazing." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My chest tightened, and I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to wake Sarah up and demand an explanation. But I didn't. I just sat there, staring at the screen, feeling like my entire world had just collapsed. The next morning, I confronted her. I showed her the message and asked her point blank if she was having an affair with Mark. At first, she denied it, saying it was just a harmless flirtation. But when I pressed her, she broke down and admitted the truth. She had been seeing Mark for months. They had been meeting up after work, going to hotels, and even spending weekends together while I was at home with the kids. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. How could she do this to me? To our family? I asked her why, and she just shrugged, saying she didn't know. She said she felt neglected, that I wasn't giving her enough attention. But that didn't make sense to me. I had always been there for her, always put her and the kids first. How could she throw all of that away for a fling with my boss? Didn't know what to do. I was angry, hurt, and completely lost. I told her I needed time to think, to figure out what this meant for us. She agreed, but I could see the guilt in her eyes. She knew she had destroyed something precious, something that might never be repaired. That was the beginning of the end. Over the next few weeks, I tried to make sense of everything. I thought about leaving her, about filing for divorce. But every time I looked at my kids, I felt this overwhelming sense of responsibility. I didn't want to break up our family, to put them through the pain of a divorce. But at the same time, I didn't know if I could ever forgive Sarah for what she had done. And then there was Mark. I couldn't stand the thought of seeing him at work, of pretending like everything was normal. I thought about quitting, about finding another job. But I knew that would only make things harder for my family. So I stayed, putting on a brave face while inside, I was falling apart. This is where my story begins. A story of betrayal, heartbreak, and the struggle to find a way forward. It's not an easy story to tell, but it's one that needs to be told. Because sometimes, the hardest truths are the ones we need to face the most. The days after the confrontation were a blur. I felt like I was living in a nightmare, one I couldn't wake up from. Sarah and I barely spoke. When we did, it was about the kids or the bills, mundane things that felt meaningless compared to the giant elephant in the room. She slept in the guest room, and I stayed in our bed, staring at the ceiling every night, replaying everything in my head. How had I missed the signs? How had I been so blind? Work became a living hell. Every time I saw Mark, I wanted to punch him in the face. He acted like nothing had happened, like he hadn't destroyed my marriage. He'd walk into the office with that smug grin of his, cracking jokes and acting like he was the best boss in the world. Meanwhile, I was dying inside, trying to hold it together for the sake of my job and my family. I started to notice things I hadn't before. The way Mark would glance at me during meetings like he was testing me, seeing how much I knew. The way he'd casually mention Sarah in conversations, dropping her name like it was nothing. It was like he was taunting me, and I hated him for it. But I couldn't say anything. I couldn't risk losing my job, not with 2 kids to support. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed to be in her own world. She'd go to work, come home, and barely interact with me or the kids. It was like she was on autopilot, going through the motions, but not really present. I wanted to scream at her, to demand that she snap out of it and face what she'd done. But every time I tried to bring it up, she'd shut down, saying she wasn't ready to talk. The kids noticed the tension. Of course, Emily, who's 8, started acting out at school, and Jake, who's 5, would cling to me like he was afraid I'd disappear. It broke my heart to see them like that, to know that their world was falling apart because of something they didn't understand. I tried to shield them from it, to keep things as normal as possible, but it was hard. How do you explain to a child that their mom and dad might not be together anymore? One night, after putting the kids to bed, I finally snapped. I couldn't take the silence anymore, the pretending. I stormed into the guest room where Sarah was sitting on the bed, scrolling through her phone. She looked up at me, startled, but I didn't give her a chance to say anything. "We need to talk," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You can't just pretend like nothing happened. You can't just shut me out and expect everything to be okay. You destroyed our marriage. Sarah, you destroyed us, and I need to know why. I need to know how you could do this to me. To our family." She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes filled with tears. Then she put her phone down and took a deep breath. "I don't know why, Alex," she said quietly. "I don't know why I did it. I felt so lost, like I didn't know who I was anymore. And Mark, he made me feel seen. He made me feel wanted." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "And I didn't?" I asked, my voice breaking. "I didn't make you feel seen or wanted? I've been here for you, Sarah. I've been here for our family. How could you throw that away for someone like him?" She didn't have an answer. She just sat there, crying, while I stood there, feeling like my heart was being ripped out of my chest. I wanted to hate her, to walk away and never look back. But I couldn't. Because despite everything, I still loved her, and that made it hurt even more. The next few weeks were a roller coaster of emotions. Some days I felt like I could forgive her, like maybe we could work through this. Other days I was so angry I could barely look at her. We started seeing a marriage counselor, but it didn't help much. Every session felt like we were just going in circles, rehashing the same arguments over and over again. Sarah would apologize, and I'd try to forgive her. But the trust was gone. And without trust, what did we have? Meanwhile, things at work were getting worse. Mark started giving me more responsibilities, piling on projects and deadlines like he was trying to push me to my breaking point. I knew what he was doing. He was trying to make me quit, to get me out of the picture so he could have Sarah all to himself. But I refused to give him the satisfaction. I worked harder than ever, determined to prove that I wasn't going to let him win. But the stress was taking its toll. I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating, and I was constantly on edge. I started snapping at the kids, at Sarah, at anyone who got in my way. I felt like I was losing myself, like the person I used to be was slipping away, replaced by this angry, bitter version of me that I didn't even recognize. One night, after a particularly brutal day at work, I came home to find Sarah sitting at the kitchen table waiting for me. She had a serious look on her face, and I knew something was wrong. "We need to talk," she said, echoing the words I'd said to her weeks earlier. I sat down across from her, bracing myself for whatever was coming next. "What is it?" I asked, my voice flat. She took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant," she said. The words hit me like a ton of bricks. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "What?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm pregnant," she repeated. "And it's Mark's." I don't remember what happened after that. Everything went blurry, like I was watching the scene from outside my body. I remember standing up, knocking over my chair, and storming out of the house. I remember driving, aimlessly, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I remember screaming at the top of my lungs, the sound echoing in the empty car. When I finally came back to reality, I was parked outside a bar. I didn't even think twice before walking in and ordering a drink, and then another, and another. I didn't want to think, didn't want to feel. I just wanted to numb the pain, even if it was only for a little while. But no amount of alcohol could make me forget what Sarah had told me. She was pregnant, with Mark's child. The thought made me sick to my stomach. How could this be happening? How could my life have spiraled so out of control? I didn't go home that night. I couldn't face Sarah. Couldn't face the reality of what she'd told me. Instead, I checked into a cheap motel and spent the night staring at the ceiling, wondering how I was going to get through this. This is where my story takes a turn I never saw coming. Because as much as I thought things couldn't get any worse, I was wrong. They were about to get a whole lot worse. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a heavy heart. The motel room smelled like stale cigarettes and regret, and for a moment, I just lay there, staring at the cracked ceiling, trying to piece together what had happened. Then it all came rushing back. Sarah's confession, the pregnancy, the fact that my life was falling apart in ways I couldn't even begin to comprehend. I checked my phone and saw a dozen missed calls from Sarah. I didn't have the energy to call her back. Instead, I sent her a text. "I need some time. Don't call me." Then I turned off my phone and got in the car. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't go home. Not yet. I ended up driving to my brother's place. Mike has always been the one person I could count on, no matter what. He's 2 years older than me, and he's been through his own share of heartbreak. When I showed up at his door, unshaven, and looking like I hadn't slept in days, he didn't ask questions. He just let me in, handed me a beer, and sat down next to me on the couch. "What's going on, Alex?" he asked after a long silence. I took a deep breath and told him everything. The affair, the pregnancy, the mess my life had become. He listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with every word. When I finished, he shook his head and let out a low whistle. "Damn, man," he said. "I don't even know what to say. That's a lot." "Yeah," I said, staring at the floor. "It is." Mike leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What are you going to do?" I shrugged. "I don't know. I can't even think straight right now. I feel like my whole world is falling apart." Mike was quiet for a moment, then he said, "You know you can't run away from this, right? You've got to face it, no matter how much it hurts. For the kids, if nothing else." I knew he was right, but that didn't make it any easier. The thought of going back home, of facing Sarah and the mess we'd made of our lives, made me feel sick to my stomach. But I couldn't hide forever. I had responsibilities, a family to take care of. So after a few hours, I thanked Mike for listening, got back in the car, and drove home. Sarah was waiting for me when I walked through the door. She looked like she hadn't slept either, her eyes red and puffy from crying. The kids were at school, so the house was quiet, the silence heavy with tension. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I needed some space," I said, not meeting her eyes. I couldn't be here." She nodded, like she understood, but I could see the hurt in her face. "We need to talk about this, Alex," she said. "We can't just ignore it." "I know," I said, sinking into a chair, "but I don't even know where to start." We sat there for what felt like hours, talking and crying and yelling. Sarah apologized over and over again, saying she never meant to hurt me, that she never wanted things to go this far, but the damage was done, and no amount of apologies could change that. The hardest part was talking about the baby. Sarah said she didn't know what to do, that she was scared and confused. I didn't know what to say. The thought of her having Mark's child made me feel physically ill, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her what to do. It was her body, her choice. But whatever she decided, I knew it would change everything. In the end, we agreed to take things one day at a time. We'd keep going to counseling, keep trying to work through this, but I didn't know if it would be enough. The trust between us was shattered, and I didn't know if it could ever be repaired. Meanwhile, things at work were getting worse. Mark was still piling on the pressure, and I was struggling to keep up. I started making mistakes, missing deadlines, forgetting meetings, snapping at coworkers. I knew I was on thin ice, but I couldn't seem to pull myself together. One day Mark called me into his office. I knew it was coming. I'd messed up a big project, and I was sure he was going to fire me. But when I walked in, he didn't look angry. He looked smug. "Alex," he said, leaning back in his chair. "We need to talk." I sat down, my heart pounding. "What's going on?" He folded his hands on the desk and gave me a cold smile. "I know about you and Sarah," he said. "I know you're struggling, and I want you to know that I'm here to help." I stared at him, my blood boiling. "Help?" I spat. "You're the reason my life is falling apart. You're the one who ruined my marriage." He shrugged, like it was no big deal. "Sarah's a grown woman, Alex. She made her own choices. And if you can't handle that, maybe you're not cut out for this job." I wanted to punch him. I wanted to scream at him, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd caused me. But I didn't. I just sat there, seething, while he went on about how I needed to get my act together if I wanted to keep my job. When I finally left his office, I felt like I was going to explode. I couldn't believe the audacity of this man, the way he acted like he was doing me a favor by not firing me. I wanted to quit, to walk out and never look back. But I couldn't. Not with 2 kids to support, not with a mortgage to pay. I was trapped, and there was no way out. That night, I sat down with Sarah and told her what had happened. She looked horrified, but she didn't say much. I could tell she felt guilty, but it didn't make me feel any better. Nothing did. As the weeks went by, things only got harder. Sarah's pregnancy started to show, and every time I looked at her, I was reminded of what she'd done. The counseling sessions weren't helping, and the tension between us was unbearable. I felt like I was drowning, like I couldn't catch my breath. And then, one night, everything came to a head. Sarah and I got into a huge fight. The kind of fight where you say things you can't take back. I accused her of ruining my life, of destroying our family. She screamed at me, saying I was never there for her, that I didn't understand her. It was ugly. And by the end of it, we were both in tears. That's when I realized something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this, in this toxic, suffocating cycle of anger and pain. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I couldn't keep going down this path. This is where my story takes another turn, a turn that would change everything. Because sometimes, when you hit rock bottom, the only way to go is up. The fight with Sarah was the breaking point. After that night, something inside me shifted. I realized I couldn't keep living in this limbo, torn between anger and heartbreak, trying to hold together a marriage that felt like it was already over. I needed to make a decision, not just for me, but for my kids. They deserved better than this. I deserved better than this. The next morning, I sat down with Sarah and told her how I felt. I can't keep doing this, I said, my voice steady, despite the storm of emotions inside me. I can't keep pretending like everything's okay when it's not. We're hurting each other, and we're hurting the kids. Something has to change. She looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. What are you saying, Alex? Are you saying you want a divorce? I took a deep breath. I don't know what I want, but I know I can't keep living like this. I think we need to separate, at least for a while. We need to figure out what we want, what's best for the kids, and how to move forward. She didn't argue. She just nodded, like she'd been expecting this. Okay, she said quietly. If that's what you need, then... okay. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of logistics and emotions. We told the kids together, sitting them down and explaining that Mommy and Daddy needed some time apart, but that we both loved them very much. Emily cried, and Jake just looked confused, asking if it was his fault. That broke my heart more than anything. I hugged them both tightly, promising them that no matter what happened, I would always be there for them. Sarah moved into an apartment nearby, and I stayed in the house with the kids. It was strange, being alone in the house we'd shared for so long. Every room felt empty, every corner filled with memories of what we'd lost. But at the same time, there was a sense of relief, like I could finally breathe again. Work didn't get any easier. Mark was still his usual smug self, and I was still barely holding it together. But I started to realize that I didn't have to stay there. I didn't have to keep subjecting myself to his toxic presence. So I started looking for a new job, something that would give me a fresh start. It wasn't easy. I sent out dozens of resumes, went on countless interviews, and faced rejection after rejection. But I didn't give up. I couldn't. I had to prove to myself and to my kids that I was stronger than this, that I could rebuild my life no matter how broken it felt. And then, one day, I got a call. It was from a small logistics company on the other side of town. They'd seen my resume and wanted to bring me in for an interview. I went in with low expectations, but as soon as I walked through the door, I knew this place was different. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, and the people seemed genuinely kind. By the end of the interview, I was offered the job on the spot. It wasn't a huge step up in terms of salary, but it was a chance to start over. And that was worth more than money. I gave my notice at my old job the next day. Mark tried to act like he didn't care, but I could see the surprise in his eyes. He'd thought he had me trapped, that I'd never have the guts to leave. But I wasn't that person anymore. I wasn't going to let him control my life. The day I walked out of that office for the last time, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in months, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny. It was a small victory, but it was mine. Meanwhile, Sarah and I were slowly figuring out how to co-parent. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of tension and anger, but we were trying. We'd agreed to put the kids first, no matter what, and that meant setting aside our own feelings and working together. One night after dropping the kids off at Sarah's apartment, she asked me to stay for a cup of coffee. We sat at her kitchen table, the silence between us heavy, but not hostile. Finally, she spoke. "I'm sorry, Alex," she said, her voice trembling. for everything. I know I messed up, and I know I hurt you. I hope you can forgive me someday." I looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel anger. I just felt sadness. Sadness for what we'd lost, for the life we'd built and then destroyed. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said honestly, "but I'm trying. For the kids and for myself." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "That's all I can ask for." As I drove home that night, I realized that this was my life now. A life of uncertainty and change, but also a life of possibility. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a chance to rebuild, to create something new. This is where my story takes its final turn, a turn toward hope. Because no matter how dark things get, there's always a chance for a new beginning. Life has a way of moving forward, even when you feel stuck. The months that followed were a mix of challenges and small victories, but slowly, I began to find my footing again. The new job turned out to be exactly what I needed. The team was supportive, the work was fulfilling, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was valued, not just as an employee, but as a person. It was a stark contrast to the toxic environment I'd left behind, and it gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't realized I'd been missing. The kids adjusted to the new routine better than I expected. Emily and Jake were resilient, as kids often are, and they seemed to thrive under the structure Sarah and I had worked hard to create. We split custody evenly, and while it wasn't always easy, we made it work. The hardest part was seeing Sarah's growing belly, a constant reminder of the betrayal that had shattered our marriage. But over time, even that became easier to bear. I focused on being the best dad I could be, and that gave me a sense of stability in the chaos. Sarah and I continued to co-parent, and while things between us were far from perfect, we managed to keep things civil for the sake of the kids. She gave birth to a baby girl a few months later, and though it was painful to see her with Mark's child, I couldn't bring myself to resent the baby. She was innocent in all of this, and I knew she'd need all the love and support she could get. Emily and Jake adored their baby sister, and I was proud of them for embracing her without hesitation. As for Mark, I heard through the grapevine that his relationship with Sarah didn't last. Apparently, he wasn't the kind of guy who stuck around when things got tough. Sarah never talked about it, and I didn't ask. It wasn't my business anymore. I'd moved on, and so had she, in our own ways. Therapy helped. I started seeing a counselor on my own, and it gave me the tools to process everything I'd been through. I learned to let go of the anger and focus on what I could control. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I felt like I was taking one step forward and 2 steps back. But I kept going, because I knew I owed it to myself and to my kids to be the best version of me I could be. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, I sat on the couch with a cup of coffee and let myself reflect on everything that had happened. It had been a year since I'd found out about Sarah's affair, and so much had changed. I wasn't the same person I'd been back then. I was stronger, more resilient, and more aware of my own worth. I'd learned that life doesn't always go the way you plan, but that doesn't mean it's over. Sometimes it's just the beginning of something new. I thought about Sarah, about the life we'd built together and the life we'd lost. I didn't hate her anymore. I didn't love her the way I once had, but I didn't hate her. She was the mother of my children, and in her own way, she was trying to do better. That was enough for me. As for me, I was finally starting to feel like myself again. I'd even started dating. Nothing serious, just casual outings with people who made me laugh and reminded me that there was still joy to be found in the world. It was scary, putting myself out there again, but it was also exciting. I wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, I was okay with not having all the answers. This is where my story ends, or maybe where it begins again. Because life isn't about the mistakes we make or the pain we endure. It's about how we pick ourselves up and keep moving forward. It's about finding the strength to rebuild, even when it feels impossible. And it's about realizing that no matter how broken we feel, we're never beyond repair. Thank you for listening to my story. I know it wasn't easy to hear, but I hope it reminded you that even in the darkest moments, there's always a way forward. If you've been through something similar, know that you're not alone. And if you're struggling, don't be afraid to reach out for help. You're stronger than you think, and you deserve happiness. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this. And remember, no matter what you're going through, there's always hope for a better tomorrow.